All right. Again, good afternoon, everyone. And again, thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started on our technical webinar presentation about mapping post-fire reforestation opportunities for private non-industrial landowners in California. This is a collaboration between UC Cooperative Extension, Post-Fire Forest Resilience Program, and American Forests, and hosted by the wonderful California Fire Science Consortium. And my name is Nick Dutch. I'm a member of the post-fire team. And we're going to get started today by our introduction by Central Sierra Cooperative Extension Forestry Advisor, Susie Coker.
Okay, I'm going to start by sharing my screen. There we go. All right, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Katanya. I'm happy to be here, and I am going to give you an overview of our new tool, or why we need it, and leave it to other presenters to talk about exactly how it was developed and how to use it. So let me go ahead and get started. I worked with the U.S. Forest Service and received a large grant in 2021 from the Forest Service State and Private branch, the Disaster Resilience Grant. And a number of you on the line probably also received some of these funds. They were used to fund some of the new emergency forest restoration teams. As Cooperative Extension, we had a specific work plan with these 4 deliverables. And our goals were to help forestry assistance agencies, such as nonprofits, RCDs, and our state agencies, better understand and target post-fire assistance programs. That was the one that led us to development of this tool that we're discussing today. We also had a deliverable to document and help develop lessons learned from our post-fire assistance programs. So funding, as I said, from both this disaster resilience grant and CAL FIRE went into formation of emergency forest restoration teams that were spread out specifically across the landscape from fires from 2019 to 21. The 3 pilot programs were following the Caldor fire, the Tamarack fire, and the Dixie fire. And so we did a whole process of interviewing implementers to identify how development of new assistance programs at the local level function for getting forest restoration done more quickly. That's the whole goal of this model. We came out with our report last year, and we're continuing work on that. We said we would develop an educational program to empower landowners and communities to respond to wildfires and help build broad awareness of post-fire restoration strategies and best practices. So these are some of our products to date. We are launching today with collaboration from American Forests, this Reforestation Opportunity Assessment Tool. Here is the report on item number 2 on lessons learned that we published in 2024. We're also continuing to work with local resource conservation districts on monitoring reforestation. We have active collaborations with Feather River and El Dorado in the Dixie and the Caldor fire to assess the effectiveness of replanting trees. We developed a online educational workshop series. So far, we've held 8 5 to 7 week long Zoom workshops with field days on reforestation for about 300 people around the state with fires from 2019 to 21, including over in the Redwoods, up in Siskiyou County, Plumas, Sierra. It's been really an amazing educational journey for me and the folks that we work with to really get that overview of the whole state. And what's going on with reforestation. And as part of our deliverables, we're putting all that content that our partners shared with us and that we shared with participants, private landowners and professionals, into an online asynchronous course. And so we've hired an instructional designer, and we're busy developing a course that could be taken by individuals after a fire occurs to them without a guided workshop series the way that we did. So we're excited about that. We're making great progress, and Then, as far as that number 4, broad awareness, we have developed a number of educational materials, talks, conferences, and then are working on an educational toolkit that will help share the lessons that we've learned educating people about post-fire restoration. So big shout out to my co-PI there in the picture, Ryan Tompkins, who was an important member of the team and helped bring us together with American Forests to develop this assessment. Okay, so just to frame the issue a little bit, as we all probably know, there's too much high severity fire happening, and especially here in the Sierra Nevada. I'm in the Central Sierra, and we've had research recently kind of showing us the increase in high severity fire from before settlement and the gold rush, about 7% of the landscape, up to 2020, about 36% of the landscape, and that's not really counting the big season of 2021. So we know that there's large patches of high severity fire, like in the picture, where our conifers, most of which are adapted to low severity fire and having standing sea trees nearby, do not have as much chance to regenerate on their own without active reforestation. That's not to say that some of the wildfires are not leaving good ecological work behind, because if it's 36% high severity, that's 64% that's not. And those areas are important too, absolutely. And we should be tending to those and thinking about how to work with landowners to help them manage or thin or move on from those fires too. But with this project, we've really focused on those high severity fires because of the risk of type conversion in many areas, as the other study that I've quoted here, especially in the Southern Sierra. We're seeing type conversion to shrub ecosystems without active reforestation. Some areas, of course, climate change is making that more difficult, but there's still plenty of wonderful places to plant a conifer in the Sierra Nevada that would benefit from active reforestation. Here are some photos from my colleague, Ryan Tompkins, to kind of illustrate this issue. This is a picture on the left of after the Moonlight Fire in 2009. You see a property boundary. On the right, you see the Forest Service. On the left, you see industrial timberlands managed by W.M. Beatty and Associates. They were able to go in immediately, plant trees, remove dead trees, and get a new forest started. Whereas the Forest Service was not able to do that. And you can see 10 years later, there's not really a forest starting. That's not to say that the industrial timber model is our model for private forest landowners, but it's just to help visualize that active reforestation does return to a treed landscape much more quickly than not doing anything. Okay, so reforestation has to be done in a timely manner. In the Sierra Nevada specifically, we have a lot of shrub competition. If you wait and delay, you will have lots more competition for your seedlings. And so doing it quickly requires fewer resources. It's less expensive. The steps for reforestation are quite complex. There's a number of things that need to be done, including ordering tree seedlings, removing dead trees, woody debris, reducing fuels, and planting, and then controlling vegetation that competes with trees over a number of years. So it's a complex process that can be done and lead to great success. But there does need to be a level of planning, understanding, and resources to actually accomplish it. Okay, so with that kind of background, I just wanted to really return our attention to land ownership in California. We have 32 million acres of forest. 60% of that is federally or state or local, so public land, and 40% is private. We have 5 million acres of industrial timber companies and more land that's actually owned by individuals or non-industrial private forest land owners. And a lot of fragmentation in the size of parcels. 90% of the ownerships own 50 acres or less. And that's very, not very close to being something that you can do as a living on your property. And so private landowners with smaller holdings are not necessarily in the business of forestry. They have occasional management activities and a small landscape to manage. That said, there's 75,000 landowners with more than 10 acres of forest in California. Those are numbers from the Forest Service's National Woodland Owner Survey from 2018. So you can see there would be a large number of people in that ownership who might need technical assistance to move forward with reforestation, which is much different than industrial timberlands where they have experts and it's their business, so they're in reforesting quickly, and federal lands who have had cutbacks in capacity and other barriers to actually getting reforestation done. So here's a little figure from the California Wildfire Resilience Task Force from February of 2024. That was the working group on reforestation. And this figure, I think, is quite illustrative of some of the challenges that the Forest Service has faced in reforesting areas of high severity fire. So you can see down here, 2010 to 2014, they were accomplishing about 36% of the acres that burned in high severity, so most at need of reforestation. But then the increase in burned areas turned about that same amount into just short of 8% of the area being reforested between 2015 and 2020. And so, you know, there's been a lot going on recently with the Reforestation Pipeline Partnership to try and increase capacity. We're getting more seedlings, we're getting more cone collectors, we're getting lots of contractors to try and help us bridge this gap. But there is, you know, a huge challenge on federal lands getting that work done, and a lot of backlog. So how about private non-industrial owners? So I explained that's 7 million acres, so it's a large fraction, 25% of the forest in California. On the left, we have just kind of a schematic of what I said earlier and some of the actual time frame involved in conducting successful reforestation. But we also have barriers specific to non-industrial private landowners, many of whom may have lived on the landscape for a while and known what to do for managing a mature forest, but having to start over with a reforestation process. Not very many people have experience with that. Lack of funding, it's expensive. If there's been a big wildfire, contractors are less interested in working for you if you have a small land ownership. There's been lack of seedlings. And then unlike maybe our agency and private timber company owners, there's also just a huge amount of pressing needs to address after a wildfire. I was fortunate to partner with Dr. Lynn Hunsinger at UC Berkeley and one of her grad students, Lulu Wax. And we went out and interviewed everyone affected by a large wildfire on the west slope of the Sierra in 2014. Every private forest landowner. It was about 14,000 acres. We got to most of them and interviewed them about how losing their forest had affected them and, you know, kind of how they've thought about reforestation. So basically, they had a lot of recovery to manage. Some people had lost homes, they'd lost equipment, and they needed really to be focusing on all sorts of things like clearing debris and restoring wells. Trees were not necessarily the number one thing that they had on their plate after a big event like this. There was a lot of emotional impact and effort to going forward with restoring lives. And people really thought about trees as part of that, restoring their pre-fire life, right? And the quote on the left is from that study about the trees and how that was really difficult for people. The term that's been coined is solastalgia, which is nostalgia for the solace and comfort that the landscape used to afford. So that's a big reason a lot of people live in the forest. And so there's all sorts of emotional components of trying to recover from an event at the same time that you're trying to work on reforestation. That said, most of the landowners that we talk to, all of the landowners we've ever talked to, want to reforest. They want to put trees back. They list a lot of reasons that I've listed there, but a lot of them really need the assistance to do that and really could not have done it without assistance. People may have had equipment and thought they could do some themselves, but after that burned up, they really needed help. So the study that we did looked at an assistance program that was offered by a local RCD, and what they did was apply for a grant, and they used that to take an area-wide approach to treat and offer an assistance program to all the parcels within the fire perimeter. And so what that means is they did the permitting, they contracted out the work, and they monitored implementation. And landowners had no costs, unlike other assistance programs that you might have to apply for through USDA or CAL FIRE that are competitive. You have to get the work done yourself and pay for it and get reimbursed. So this helped people. We had people living on 5 acres, on low income, and people who at the other end were high income and had large acreage. And so that area-wide approach really worked to reach a lot of people at once. So what the landowners told us was that without the program, probably a third of them would have taken no action at all because they didn't know how or didn't have the equipment or funds. A third of them might have tried to do some planting every year, and a third could have tried to apply for standard assistance programs. And so that really helped me with my thinking about the best ways of reaching private non-industrial landowners because of all those barriers that were described. So the task force has taken up this idea that was pioneered by the RCD with their development of emergency forest restoration teams. So I really think that moving forward with this model, as we've described in the lessons learned report that I mentioned earlier, shows a lot of promise for getting trees and reforestation in the ground on private non-industrial lands. So I guess that's my modicum of hope I'd like to offer people. I think there's a lot of hope in this area and people really want to reforest. So it's one ownership along with private industrial. And I think that we can get the work done if we have adequate technical assistance and funding to get this work done. So that said, how are we going to reach and identify landowners who are in need of this kind of reforestation assistance? I've worked in extension on forestry for many years, and we've always really wanted some kind of a database that helped us reach landowners. We know that there's ways you could go to the county tax rolls and get parcel layers and do the work to overlay other things in your GIS system, but everybody's going to approach it differently. So what we decided was we wanted to have a methodology that we could use to look at everything across the state at the same time. That would help agencies, statewide agencies, prioritize. It should also really look at individual fires that could help local agencies and nonprofits prioritize where to provide assistance to landowners. And it's called Reforestation Opportunity, just to say, is it a need? I don't know. It's a little bit of semantics, but it's a needs assessment of where reforestation could be useful and assistance programs could be useful to private landowners. So our previous methodologies relied on large wildfires that had public lands nearby. They didn't integrate parcel information to help reach out to people. They don't integrate demographic information, which is something that local agencies often would want to use, especially if you're in an area where English isn't the first language or there's other constraints that would be helpful to understanding from an outreach perspective. So that's my setup of how and why we got to this tool. And I'm happy to then move it on to the tool experts.
All right, folks, can everyone see my screen?
I
I'm
see
gonna
it.
take,
Looks great.
awesome. Thank you, appreciate it. So hi, everyone. My name is Libby Pansing. I am the Senior Director of Forest and Restoration Science at American Forest, and I've had the distinct pleasure of working with Susie, Nick, Katie, and Ryan on this project for a little while now. So really excited to roll it out and have folks be able to take a look and do some playing around with the application. So to talk a little bit before I dive in about what some of our goals were, even though Susie did highlight those really nicely. But and then move into our methodologies and then kind of introduce everyone to the application. But my hope is really that you all can dive in and just start playing with it and see what kind of useful information is there. I'm not going to have time to cover every single trick or every single feature that we put into the application, but hopefully you all can just get in there and start clicking around. So as Susie mentioned, we were really interested in developing an application, an interactive web tool that would support folks conducting outreach or trying to prioritize where that outreach and activities should take place following large wildfires. So what we did for this application was we analyzed the landscape, so all of the fires between 2019 and 2021 across the state to understand where the reforestation opportunity is across the state on those non-industrial private forest lands. We looked at the key demographic and social variables that we think might be useful in helping to prioritize some of that outreach. And then we tried to understand where the capacity is across the state and how that aligns with that reforestation opportunity. So where are the RCDs well staffed? Where are the registered professional foresters? And how does that actually overlap with that reforestation opportunity? So those were basically the three different objectives that we were trying to achieve with the development of this app. So I'll go into methods really quickly just to give everybody a sense of how we thought about reforestation opportunity. And I also want to kind of talk a little bit about some caveats with this as well. So what we did to identify that reforestation opportunity, and again, Susie mentioned this, but we're talking about it as an opportunity and not necessarily a need. And I think that's from two perspectives. One is that I think need implies that one, we're thinking about type conversion and that's happening, and we're not necessarily sure that that type conversion might happen in those locations, although there is a probability that it could. The second is really an acknowledgement that some of these geospatial methodologies are not they're not perfectly accurate. If you take different layers, you're going to get different answers. And so this is really intended to just be that tool that helps folks to start understanding where those opportunities lie to support kind of that initial outreach and ground truthing that is going to be necessary in order to actually plan and implement any kind of post-fire reforestation across these parcels. So what we did when we started trying to understand where the reforestation opportunity was, is we had three conditions. The land had to have been previously forested prior to the fire. It had to have burned at moderate or high severity, and it had to have impacted suspected non-industrial private forest lands. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute here. But what we talked about when we were thinking about areas that were previously forested, we used California's multi-source vegetation layer, the wildlife habitat relationships, and we looked at both hardwood and conifer categories. So we didn't restrict this to just conifer forest types. We do have hardwoods in there, so that's something to consider. But we really did want to focus on those areas that had forest lands prior to being burned. For a fire severity standpoint, we looked at both moderate or high severity. We included moderate because I think there's also the sense of, if a landowner wants to reforest their property, they should be afforded the opportunity to do so. So we don't necessarily want to constrain that too strictly or too severely, but also there's things like delayed mortality that could potentially impact these landowners and these landscapes. And we might not see as much regeneration in some of those moderately burned areas, but really kind of a focus was on those high severity areas where stand replacing fire has occurred because of that increased risk of type conversion and delayed regeneration or regeneration failure following some of these large and really high severe fires. One of the tricks that we kind of played with this, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, is that we used an aggregate of three different mapping methodologies. So we used monitoring trends in burn severity, so MTBS, fire severity data, ravage, or the rapid assessment in vegetation condition after wildfire, and the burned area reflectance classification, which is part of the BEAR program. We used all three of these to maximize the spatial coverage that we get across the wildfires. So even though these methods are going to result in a little bit of different outcomes, we'll talk about it again in a second, we are seeing that using all three of these maximizes our ability to respond quickly to fires and also include as many fires as possible throughout the landscape. So when we talk about this fire severity mapping, each of these different existing programs to map wildfire severity have their own quirks and their own kind of targeted reasons for being produced. So I want to talk about this for a little bit. So if you look at this table on the right-hand side of your screen, MTBS, or the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity, that has the broadest geospatial coverage. So they really look at every fire that has burned nationwide since 1984 across both CONUS and Alaska. The constraint there is that the fires have to be larger than 500 acres. So anything smaller than that is not included in these maps. The challenge with what is going on with MTBS is that it is a long runway between fire containment and when these maps are actually released to the broader public. So generally they're looking at 6 to 12 months, but sometimes we have time periods as long as 2 years that pass before we actually get these MTBS data sets that are released. So to Susie's point earlier, we recognize that there's a time component that's really important with reforestation, but if we're not getting these maps out until a year or so after the fire, then we're potentially missing some of that window where that reforestation is a little bit easier and a little bit cheaper. So that is one piece that's constraining with MTBS. If we think about ravage, that's a secondary mapping piece that is put together by the Forest Service, and it is really intended to target federal lands, mostly National Forest System lands. So it has a constrained geospatial coverage as compared to MTBS. So if we start thinking about ravage, that is only mapping wildfires that have burned more than 1,000 acres on federal lands. So if we have a really large fire that has burned on mostly private non-industrial lands, then Ravage is not going to map, or GTAC is actually the organization that maps it, but they're not going to actually create these Ravage products because it's not sufficiently covering the federal lands that they are focused on. The benefit of Ravage is that it tends to be released pretty quickly following wildfire. So we generally think of it about, usually a month. They tend to target 30 days post-fire containment, having these ravaged maps released. And so we have that constrained timeline, which means that we can potentially try to identify those locations that have burned at high severity a little bit more quickly. And we can start mobilizing a little bit more quickly when we have access to these ravaged maps. The last one is bark, and I'll probably refer to this as bear just moving forward because it's part of the bear program, is really intended to only map areas where there are threats to life and or property. So these folks are very much focused on like, how do we prevent erosion issues? How do we prevent flood? Um, how do we start responding to those immediate during fire or immediate post-fire needs? And so those are generally created immediately following fire containment or even prior to fire containment. So again, we have this very rapid turnaround, but it is very constrained to those fires where life or property are threatened. And therefore, if we have some of these more remote locations with larger parcels or a lot of federal land, we might not see any kind of bark maps that are coming out and providing us with this utility to actually go do this mapping. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that we use different approaches for the different fires. And again, this is just based on what was available previously when we started conducting this project. And so we have essentially combined all three of these, but there are some limitations and challenges with that. So in instances where we have multiple different mapping methods, this is the 2020 glass fire. So what you're looking at here is you have the fire perimeter in each of these different panels, and each of these different color maps or the chloroplus represent the fire severity across each of the fires based on those different methodologies. So on the left-hand side, you can see that Ravage didn't pick up any high severity burned areas. So it's assuming that nothing is stand replacing, but we do have some moderate burns within that fire footprint. In contrast, you have these bark or bear maps, and we're starting to see a little bit more of that moderate severity burn across this northern portion of this fire. But we're also starting to get a little bit of high severity burns in here. And then with MTBS, we're starting to get even a little bit more. Most of this is because MTBS is calibrated, and so they have folks actually kind of trying to understand where these thresholds of their different remote sensing technologies have been applied. So as we start thinking about this, there are differences. So for Ravage, we saw about 990 acres in this bottom table of moderate severity fire. Bear had us mapped at about 16,200. MTBS had us mapped for that moderate and high severity burn at 23,200 acres. So, if we're thinking about MTBS is giving us an additional 22,200 acres of high severity burn or moderate severity burn across that fire footprint compared to Ravage. And it's giving us an additional 16,500 acres when compared to Bear. And so this is true across this, and this is just based on those geospatial, like how they're thinking about doing these different mapping approaches in order to kind of have that trade-off between really fast turnaround, but also trying to get us at least an initial output to start responding to some of these post-fire needs. So this one is the 2020 SEU complex. We did not have a Ravage component for this because it did not burn more than 1,000 acres on National Forest System lands. So we only have this Bear products, which gave us about 35,200 acres of post-fire, of moderate or high severity across that fire footprint versus MTBS gave us about 59,000 acres. So there's some differences here. So what we're trying to do with this application is really give everybody the opportunity to respond quickly, but also potentially the goal the vision is to update this over time so that we can kind of see those and start making some better decisions as we have more accurate mapping opportunities across the landscape that are more tailored to some of the basal area mortality that we're seeing across the landscape. So there are differences, but we started to really think that that spatial coverage is really important to have us be able to make those initial endeavors and conduct that initial outreach in a timely manner. So that spatial coverage we've prioritized over trying to find one particular methodology to use and bring to the table for this application. So I want to pivot a little bit and just talk about this process again. So we've basically said that we are going to take the bear maps, the MTBS maps, and the ravage maps, and we're going to use a combination of all three of those. So what we did when we had that is we essentially looked at everything in these higher severity classes. So 3 and 4 are our moderate and high severity class here. For context, this is the Dixie Fire. So we're trying to retain everything in this fire severity map that is moderate or high severity, so in these warmer color tones. We then looked at the WER type vegetation categories and selected all of those that were in the hardwood or conifer categories. And we looked for areas where those two pieces overlapped. So if you look in this map on the right-hand side, we're looking at those areas where we had moderate or high severity and we had a conifer or hardwood forest type based on those WER type models. So this is essentially just collectively like whittling down the amount of area that we're going to look into, right? So we have acres with severity mapping, we have acres that burned at moderate or high severity, and then we whittle that down further to forested acres that are burned at moderate or high severity. And I mentioned one other thing before I pivot to parcels, but the first is that really when we're thinking about the order of this, if we had MTBS, we took an MTBS layer. If we didn't have MTBS, our preference was a ravage layer. And if we didn't have a ravage layer, our preference was to take the bark. So in those instances where we had multiple mapping methodologies, we did have a prioritization tier of which one of those we did use in that specific instance. So for all of the locations that we identified that were moderate or high severity fire or impacted by those high severity fires, we then looked at the reforestation opportunity by parcel. So PNIFL should be NIPF. My brain does acronyms in different way, but that's just private non-industrial forest lands. And we used data compiled by a company called Regrid that really just takes publicly available county assessors data and compiles it and standardizes it in a way that is more easy to query and to use from a geospatial perspective. So we use this information to essentially identify what we thought were private non-industrial forest lands and then intersected where we thought that reforestation opportunity was, such that it really only covered those parcels where there was reforestation opportunity and we thought that the parcel was private non-industrial. Once we have that, that's essentially our reforestation opportunity across these private non-industrial lands. And then for objectives 2 and 3, we started thinking a little bit more about those demographics and where those capacity opportunities and constraints are. So the first thing we looked at was we looked at demographics. So we looked at census tracts that are overlapping with where we have reforestation opportunity across those non-industrial parcels, and really started to try to look at the relationship between the amount of acres that are a reforestation opportunity and what some of those demographic characteristics look like. So we looked at CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, and this is based on the 2020 or most recent census tracts that are available. And then we also did a little bit with SB 535's disadvantaged communities, but this has a few limitations, mostly based on the fact that it is focusing on pollution is a big aspect, which is a little bit less prevalent in some of those rural communities, and it's focused in those urban areas as a result. So we have complete spatial coverage for all census tracts, and it also provides us the ability to dig into specific variables like the proportion of individuals that speak into English as a second language, or those types of things where we can really dig into the whys behind it and not necessarily just identify a tract as disadvantaged without knowing what those underlying reasons are. So this is an example for the SB 535 disadvantaged communities. If you look at the fire perimeters that we included in this application, which are all of the black polygons across the map, you will see that there are actually only 8 disadvantaged communities that pop up and overlap with those fires. So this is of limited utility again, because, you know, we're not seeing that overlap with disadvantaged communities because those tend to be centered more around those urban areas and focused on pollution. So the CDC's approach gives us a really great way to dive into that with that complete spatial coverage and a little bit more detail. And we'll talk about that when we start going through the application. The last piece we really looked at was that capacity. So we have the reforestation opportunity by county across the state. And we look at some of these different pieces, like where is there a UCA forester? How many RPFs exist across that county? Are there EFRT teams, effort teams that can support post-fire reforestation or are in the process of doing that? And we compiled these from various different sources. So just reaching out to partners like the CARCDs, CAL FIRE, and others who could potentially provide us with additional information that could be pulled into that application. Okay, diving into the application. So if you'd like to, please do feel free to scan this QR code and it'll take you directly to the application. So hang on to that and take a screenshot, take a picture with your camera if you can, but you come back to this at any point in time and the application will be available via this QR code. And I'll also share the URL itself so that everybody can access it that way as well. But with that, we're going to dive into this application, and we're going to try to see if it's actually going to work live. Live demos always scare me. So here we go. Keep your fingers crossed. Otherwise, we'll go through some screenshots. But all right, so this is the launch of the application. It's going to land you on an information page or a README page that's just going to kind of give you an overview of what we tried to do, how we tried to do it, and some of the caveats. The one blaring caveat that I want to say before we dive into this any further is that this is a geospatial tool, so it is intended for you all to use to give you a sense of where to prioritize outreach and first steps. You must do ground-based data collection. You have to ground truth this to make sure that the geospatial data is actually telling you the right information, because there are issues, right, with resolution, or as we saw, just depending upon the mapping methodology that we take. We're not intending this to be 100% accurate so that you can take this and just start planning and go out and do some implementation work sight unseen. You have to complete this and use this as a tool to get you out into the field and start understanding what the conditions look like on the ground. So this is really intended to just be a first pass. So with that caveat, I'll dive into a few different tabs. So we have this summarized at a few different levels. The first is statewide. So this is really just giving us an understanding of what this statewide opportunity is. We have pieces. So what you can do with each of these is there's a lot of hovering and a lot of clicking that you can do in each of these pieces, but the darker the color of the fire on the map, the more the reforestation opportunity. If you hover over it, you can see the reforestation opportunity and the fire that you're hovering over. You can also toggle between some of the, base maps, row on county overlays if that's helpful, or also get a sense of the different seed zones and how they overlap with some of the areas that you're interested in. If you want to look at it from a table perspective, you can also click on the table and it'll highlight where that fire is if you have a specific fire in mind, but don't necessarily know where it is on the map. And then you'll have different statistics that are shown on the bottom. And I will caveat this by saying that I have one last update that is running in the background. So check back in on this later today and those numbers will update. You can also look at it by wildfire. So if you have a specific wildfire that you would like to look at, like let's say, for example, somebody is interested in looking at the Dixie Fire, you can select this drop down and it will take you to the Dixie Fire and give you a sense of where those parcels are across the Dixie Fire that have some kind of reforestation opportunity. So you can zoom into these. Again, you can hover over it and it should give you a sense of what the reforestation opportunity is. And you can look at this as either a proportion of the parcel or the number of acres directly that have some kind of reforestation need. So your scale will change appropriately. You can also highlight a specific parcel and it will highlight on the table which parcel that is and give you some information, and vice versa. So you can click on the table and actually see it will take you to the parcel that it thinks it is. What we have with this in the table is that reforestation opportunity, whether or not mailing addresses and other landowner specific data are available. And then you can also download some of that data to facilitate your outreach to that particular individual. The by county table is tab is very similar to the by wildfire. The only difference is that you're going to be able to select the county that you're interested in rather than the wildfire itself. So if you're only interested in Butte County, you can select Butte and the same information is going to come up. So, I can click on that and it will highlight the parcel that is available. I have to scroll down and find that. And then also we can select the tab and it will highlight the particular parcel that is you're selected in the table. What we have for demographics then are this map that is going to show us, it's going to start off on what your social vulnerability index is for each of the census tracts that overlap with some of that post-fire reforestation opportunity on private non-industrial lands. The darker the red, the higher the vulnerability. So you can also see we have a graph here that shows us the social vulnerability index on the x-axis, where higher is more vulnerable, and how that relates to the number of reforestation opportunity acres within a particular fire. So if I want to find one with really high social vulnerability and high need, I can just highlight over that and it'll tell me what county and what census tract that opportunity and high social vulnerability is in, so that I could potentially target my outreach to that particular location. And similarly, we have all of this listed in a table down here. The last piece I'll point out on this particular tab is that you can also choose, again, these different variables that may be better in line with what you're thinking about in terms of the demographics that you would like to support or conduct outreach to. So percent who speak English less than well, like we can look at those where we might want to be sending out mailers in alternative languages as well. So for example, in Stanislaus County, we've got 23% who speak English less than well. And in this particular tract, there are about 17,000 acres of reforestation opportunity. So it's a fairly high need with a fair number of the population who speak English less than well. So we might want to think about alternative outreach opportunities there. When we looked at capacity, so this reforestation pipeline really starts thinking about capacity. So we have these counties, which are each colored by the amount of reforestation opportunity. So again, the darker the color, the more the reforestation opportunity. And we have some information within about, again, this capacity that exists within this particular county. So if we're looking at Lassen, we have the list of the fires in the county. We have the reforestation opportunity. If there's a UCA&R forester there, if there's a CFIP contact for funding support, the number of registered professional foresters, and the Headwater Economics Rural Capacity Index. So how much ability do they actually have to support growth and capacity and potentially support some of the need in workforce capacity that might exist within that particular county. We also have this summarized again by county in the table. So you can also just kind of peruse the table as you'd like or filter that as you'd like as well. The points in here are different capacity categories. So again, you can kind of play with this, but you can highlight just to see what these different points are and how that aligns with the locations surrounding those capacity needs. So there's an RPF in Quincy. There is a developing EFRT team in the Honey Lake RCD. So it just kind of gives you a sense of geospatially where those resources are located. Last but not least, we also have a little bit of information about RCD capacity. So these are just showing the different RCDs that have post-fire reforestation support. So this looks like whether it's forestry program presence as of 2002, RPF status, and the number of full-time forestry program staff. So you can click these different drop downs and it'll change both the map itself and the graph over here. So this plot is just essentially telling us what the reforestation opportunity is on the y-axis and the forestry program presence as of 2002 across these different RCDs. So for example, in the Sonoma County RCD, there is a forestry program presence and they have 30,000 acres of reforestation need. And we also could look at where they're building one. I think Solano County or Solano RCD is probably up and running at this point, but they didn't have one at the time we were building this. So we might be looking based on the fact that they have nearly 10,000 acres. We could potentially use this as justification for additional funding to try to build that out. So lots of information in here. So again, really just encourage you all to kind of get in there and play with it, click on things, see what happens, and really hope that you find it to be something that's useful. But I think at this point in time, I will pause there and turn it over to the next set of speakers who are going to talk a little bit about how it could potentially be useful in their programs. So thanks all for listening, and I will turn it over.
Thank you both Susie and Libby for that amazing presentation. I actually wanted to take a moment to, it's at 12:54 right now. We have 5 minutes for a Q&A. And while you guys are here, I would love to segue to answering the Q&A questions. And then unfortunately, our two other presenters, Ryan Rieger over at Sierra RCD and Julia Sidman over at Butte County RCD are unable to be here with us today, but they provided really amazing videos to share their insights. So I'd love to play those after we do the Q&A. Is that all right with everyone? Okay. Amazing. Okay, so our first question is, given political headwinds, do we anticipate the U.S. Forest Service to interface more with private marketplace to support forest landowners who want to reforest? I work in seed collection and have experienced pushback when trying to work with the Forest Service on collections they are not looking to pursue for themselves.
I think that's a $64,000 question, and the answer is unknown. There's a lot of speculation we could make about future funding for private forest landowners within the Forest Service. There have been discussions of cutting a lot of programs, but at this point, I think it's not very useful to speculate. That's my answer. How about you, Libby?
We're starting with the easy questions, I think is what's happening here. No, I think I agree with you wholeheartedly, Susie. I think there's a lot of questions and a lot of folks who are doing due diligence to try to figure out how to support that. But in terms of what the productive path forward is, I think we could go a lot of different directions, and I don't know that it is. I don't have a sense that there is a solid answer to that right now, and also don't think speculation is really particularly helpful at this given stage. So sorry not to have a better answer, but I think that's where we are, unfortunately.
No, that's lovely. There was also another question that was posed to us within the chat instead of the Q&A by someone named Sam. So Sam, if you wouldn't mind putting your question actually into the Q&A because your chat disappeared. But it was something along the lines of, would you be able to assess all of the acres that need reforestation opportunity in the wildfire tab without clicking on an individual one? I'm paraphrasing here based on memory, but that was the main gist that I gathered.
Yeah, and so I think the simple answer to that is yes, but it tells you at the state level and the wildfire level what those are. So that very bottom panel is going to tell you or roll up those statistics to tell you what the acres of opportunity are at the statewide level. And then the table on the right-hand side is going to tell you what the reforestation opportunity is across each fire. So you can look at it that way on the statewide tab. And if you want more specific information about how that's broken down at an individual parcel level, that's when I would potentially recommend going into that by wildfire or by county tab.
Amazing. Thank you. Right now, we don't have any other questions at the moment, so I'm going to move over onto sharing the presentation that Julia did for us, and we can go from there.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Sidman. I am the Forestry Program Manager for the Butte County RCD. I started this position in November of this past year. Prior to that, I was Project Coordinator with the Feather River Resource Conservation District up in Quincy. And up there, I was primarily working on private land post-fire restoration with the Emergency Forest Restoration Team, which we called the effort. And so that was a project that was funded by a couple different funding sources, CAL FIRE and USDA State and Private Forestry, primarily to work with landowners that were impacted by 2020 and 2021 fires up in Plumas County. So we were focusing on the North Complex Fire, the Beckworth Complex, and the Dixie Fire. And so, yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit about how this app would have been useful to me in my position back at Feather River RCD. And then now currently in my position here at Butte RCD, which is based in Chico in Butte County, how that would be helpful to me looking forward for the, if there's more funding to continue this app to look at fires after 2021. So we just had the Park Fire in 2024, last August. But then also we do have, properties that are still in need of post-fire restoration and reforestation from the North Complex. And so how I might use it for that. And I apologize, can't be here today, but feel free to email me or call. I'll have my contact info available. Definitely happy to sit down and talk more about this, answer any questions, and talk about post-fire restoration. So I will share my screen here. Nick, can you see that? Cool. So we'll start kind of in my wheelhouse, which is still up in Plumas County, even though I am learning and loving a lot about Butte County. So like I said, we're focusing on 2020 and 2021 fires. So we've got your North Complex, then you've got this monster, which is the Dixie Fire. So looking at all of these awesome tabs, I think the ones that would be most helpful for me in my position currently and my position in the past would either be by county or by wildfire. So looking right now by wildfire, I've got the Dixie Fire selected. And so I just wanted to focus on a few properties that we did do work on, so we can do some comparisons. But zooming in here to Greenville, a town that was very highly impacted by the Dixie Fire. Unfortunately, a lot of people lost their homes. The majority of the town burned down. So we had a lot of projects that we focused on here. So this darker purple color, you can see that there's like a higher proportion of the parcel that requires reforestation. So if I had access to this app while I was a project coordinator up at Feather River RCD, this would have been really cool. And it's neat seeing this now in like hindsight once we already had identified all of our parcels, because it does match up pretty closely. Like for example, I can zoom in up here to parcels that we did work on. We did site prep, reforestation, herbicide, things like that. So I know this parcel, and this parcel are ones that we worked on. And so yeah, if I was trying to plan out my project, I could look at this cluster here. We worked on a lot of these, but I could look at this cluster here and be like, wow, okay, this whole area, this sort of Williams Valley and Pex Valley area, have a lot of landowners that have a higher proportion of the parcel with a need for reforestation. I should look at who these landowners are. I should either directly reach out to them, or, find out who this one larger landowner is, talk to them, get a sense of who their neighbors are. So, and just to, again, in hindsight, we can look at this and just see how accurate this tool is. So we've got parcel size 40 acres, reforestation opportunity 18, parcel size 76, reforestation opportunity 46, 76, 46, yep. And then parcel size 77, reforestation opportunity 26. So I know I've just got my like insider knowledge because I've spent a lot of time on these parcels. So I know part of it is like a meadow grazing area or whatever. So that's probably part of the stuff that isn't included in those reforestation opportunities. So I added up those numbers. If I were just going up off of what the app was saying, that there's potentially 90 acres for reforestation on the ground, we did, like in actual real life, we did 75.5 acres of reforestation. So pretty close. If it were like way over or way under, it would maybe give me pause, but like being able to compare those two numbers and have them be pretty close to each other, that's super cool. And just one other property. So zoom out of Greenville. We did do a bunch of work on these parcels. All of these we treated. So like it's just really cool to look at this app and see that the stuff we picked had a high proportion of need for reforestation. And this one I thought was really cool. So of course you go many miles away, you're still in Dixie Fire. This property we treated says the reforestation opportunity is 80 acres. We planted 81. So that is basically as spot on as you can get. So yeah, I think that using this app, had I been planning out the effort and I had access to this, we at the RCD had access to parcel data, but it didn't come with this built-in proportion of parcel with reforestation opportunities. So over here, you've got this download wildfire landowner data. I think it would have been super helpful to download that, join it to the parcel data that we already had, and just have access to that proportion and to that reforest opportunity acres. I think that would have been super helpful. And so, yeah, going forward, if there is more funding for this to add in more wildfires, I think people can really get a lot out of that. So now going to, here in Butte County, also a county that has had a lot of fires. We could go to the North Complex, which is a fire that the Butte County has worked with a lot of private landowners on already in Berry Creek and Feather Falls. There's still so many landowners that haven't had their property treated on, even though we're now 5 years later. So yeah, going forward now, I could continue to look at this. Of course, I'd have to look at where we've already treated, but I'm just look at that proportion of reforestation need. And of course, it's also a little different down here in the foothills because you're not going to be, planting, conifers, but it's still showing me that these parcels burned at high severity and are in need of some sort of post-fire restoration. Additionally, I'm always looking for grant funding to continue the work on past fires and to also work on the park fire. So I think this demographics tab could be really cool. A lot of grant sources offer like priority points and, give like your application a bit of a boost if you meet certain, certain categories. So, if your Butte County, say the app wanted to know how where you were at on the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. I could go to the actual Social Vulnerability Index, of course, but also it's just nice that it's right here. So I could look at this. I could see where in the county or where in that fire footprint looks like it's maybe higher on that index and just focus my time and attention on that. So yeah, I think this app is super great and would be really useful. And, like I said, I'm always looking for more funding, and I would love to get funding to assist with the park fire and to assist landowners with that. So yeah, if this were to receive more funding, and, I think everyone in the state would definitely benefit from all of the fires happening all of the time being on here. But yeah, that's how I would use this app.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Reger. I'm the Forestry Program Manager for California Association of RCDs. We are a nonprofit organization that serves as the statewide network for RCDs in California. The goal of our work broadly is to support RCDs, and we do that through securing funding, advocating for RCDs, providing technical assistance, and connecting RCDs to each other by fostering a mutually supportive network. One of the ways we support RCDs is through helping them link up with available funding opportunities, including block grants. So today I'm going to show you how CARCD would use the Reforestation Opportunity tool for some of this work. This tool is really useful for us for a few reasons. One reason being it helps us assess where there are communities of need and where funding is most needed. And more specifically on that, funders will sometimes have grant opportunities available that have some parameters, like the funding needs to be used for a specific fire, for example. So let me share my screen here. Cool. So using this tool in the statewide tab, we can see which counties were affected by which fires in the 2019 to 2021 years, and also see how much opportunity there is for reforestation. We could then more easily link RCDs in those areas to relevant funding opportunities. Similarly, sometimes funders want to know where the greatest need is, so this could also be very helpful for bundling for block grants, and that enables us to identify the highest need areas in the state, and also get information about demographics, for example. So this tab is also very useful for us. One example, CARCD had a funding opportunity come up where high need for assistance alongside communities that qualified as underserved was a requirement for the funding. So this tool would have been extremely helpful for identifying where in the state that funding would best be directed. So I can use the table here. Let's see, where is it? Use the table to kind of scroll through the whole state to see where there's high reforestation opportunity alongside like relatively high poverty level or high social vulnerability index. Or I could click on a specific fire to get details there. So here you can see all the counties affected by the 2020 August complex fire. And I can tell there's much opportunity for reforestation here in Trinity County. And there's also a relatively high percentage of people living below the poverty line. So that, again, could have been really helpful for directing those funds. Another useful tab for us, moving on to the reforestation pipeline tab. I think this tab would be useful for CARCD in that it enables us to quickly identify the presence of EFRTs right here. which you've likely heard of, but are important collaborative groups, and that's emergency forest restoration teams, if you're not aware. And they're important collaborative groups, which RCDs usually act as the lead agency, and they provide rapid assistance to private landowners following wildfires. So, yeah, using this tool, we can see where EFRTs might be needed but are not present. So, one example is Alameda here. There's a high opportunity for reforestation, but no EFRT. Same is true of San Joaquin County. High opportunity for reforestation, but no EFRTs. So, um, yeah, this could be helpful for arguing for the need for more EFRTs, where there is no EFRT presence, and help establish them where they should be prioritized. Also, California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force is and will be advocating for more EFRT funding. So this will continue to be very important. Um, and I think lastly here, the RCD capacity tab is also useful for keeping partners and agencies updated on the status of RCD capacities. We, of course, have a pretty solid understanding of RCD forestry capacity through working closely with them, but this tab could allow us to quickly verify information for potential funding opportunities or other uses. Also, it would be great if, further funding was available to make this kind of a living map. Um, Examples such as Lake County here. I think when this was being developed, there was no RPF access here, as it says. You could also check that here in the table. Um, yeah, no RPF access for Lake County. But since this was developed, CRCD prioritized helping get them an RPF on contract. So yeah, if there was more funding available to keep this as kind of a living document, living map, that would be really excellent. Um, but yeah, basically that's how CARCD will be using this tool. We can now more proactively approach RCDs in high priority areas to offer support. And yeah, before this tool, we didn't really have a great prioritization scheme, but now we can rely on a more objective tool and easily relay information to agencies. So yeah, thanks for having me, and sorry I can't join you on Wednesday.
Well, thank you so much to Julie and Ryan who couldn't be here today. I'm going to pull up a slide to give everyone's contact information and put again the link to that application. Uh, and then if there's any other questions, oh, awesome, Liv, you answered it. That would be great. Perfect. If there's any opportunity for folks to ask any more questions to our panelists, that would be lovely. If not, thank you so much for your time. And I hope you guys reach out to us and try out the tool and tell us what you think. Uh, we're also going to launch a poll on this webinar. So if you wouldn't mind hanging on and giving those the great information that we can use to help better our program. So Tanya, would you mind launching that tool for us or that poll for us?
It will auto launch as soon as this webinar closes.
Amazing. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank Libby and American Forest for developing such an awesome product. We were delighted to work with them, and it's been a great partnership, and I feel really super excited about the product. So thank you so much, Libby.
It's been a true joy working with all of you and being able to see the amazing work that you all have put in. And I just feel so grateful that we have been able to support it in some small way. You guys are doing the heavy legwork on a regular basis, and it's just really fantastic to watch what California is putting together and what UC Cooperative Extension in particular and RCDs are putting together to try to reach out to private landowners. So thanks for everything that you all are doing, and really excited to see where all of these grow and how it continues over time. So thanks all.
Oh, amazing. Thank you, everyone. With that, I think we will close this webinar. And again, if you have any further questions, please feel free to contact our panelists and our team. It was a joy to have you join us this afternoon. Thank you.